All right, people, we're back to our normally scheduled Sundays. What's it called? We took a little bit of a break. I was with one half of the Guy at the Movies podcast last week talking about the premiere of Better Call Saul, and now I'm joined by the other half, my old friend Joe, for Guy at the Movies. We're here to talk about not one, but two movies that came out this weekend, both of which are very fascinating in their own rights, and both of which warrant a lot of conversation, that being Robert Eggers' The Northman and Tom Gormican's The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, which isn't a comeback vehicle for Nicolas Cage. We're going to find out. Joe, you got anything you want to say before we get started?
Comeback vehicle? I don't know. He didn't really go anywhere. He's just doing a lot of random shit. But no, I'm ready to dive in.
We're going to find all that out, all of that more on today's episode of the Talking TV podcast. Joe, don't you just love how StreamYard will sometimes do that thing where it glitches out and it speeds up your intro for like the first couple of seconds, then it slows it down after the fact?
I'm so glad you said that, because for a couple weeks I was noticing that with our intro, and I'm like, what is that? What is going on?
Joe, you don't understand. Literally, like, there were a couple months last year where it was just happening, just nonstop. And I was so wigged out by it at first, but after a while, I just kind of got used to it, as you will with most everything else on this glitchy-ass program that we all use and love and have come to depend on. Welcome, everybody, to the Talking TV podcast. We are live on Twitch. It is Sunday morning, April 24th. I'm joined by Joe of Guy at the Movies. Joe, how you been, man? I haven't had you on in a while.
It's been quite a while. Been busy. My actual job has been really crazy. I just moved, so just a lot of stuff up in the air, trying to get settled, and then trying to, of course, keep up with all the new releases.
Of course.
Looks like we have a quiet week of new releases coming up next week, so that's positive. But
well, I mean, the last week being Secrets of Dumbledore that literally nobody watched or seemed to care about kind of gave us a little bit of a breather. But yeah, this year, I want to talk about this year for movies for a second. This year has been an interesting year so far, because you had like the first 2 months, which normally, like, in a pre-COVID year, I should say, the first 2 months of the year, January and February, are usually always kind of dead. They usually just use that as a dumping ground, but there's always usually like one or two, like maybe big ones that are able to sneak through. But then by the time we're into March, we're usually into blockbuster territory. But this year's a little bit different. This is the second year that we have in like the post-COVID times. Last year, we were, around this time, we were kind of inundated with, a lot of the weird, like, direct to HBO Max drops, in addition to the ones that were going to theaters. People weren't quite sure. They're like, okay, are theaters open? Are we supposed to go back to theaters? Is streaming and at home the new permanent thing? Nobody knew what was going on. And now we're in this weird spot where it seems like there are a bunch of movies that went to streaming that nobody knows about. But as for theaters, it feels like if a movie wasn't The Batman or Sonic in the last couple of months, it feels like at first that nobody was going to care or want to go. But then, strangely enough, somehow, Seymourix, thank you for joining the show. The Man in the North was good, not great for me. I'm going to take it that's Luke. Oh, man, that's definitely a Luke comment right there. That is a Luke comment. That is absolutely. And I'm forgetting about Morbius. Oh, man, Morbius, the movie that 2022 already forgot and is hoping to forget so badly. But yeah, you're seeing this thing where I didn't think we were going to see this happen this year, where a couple of movies that didn't open huge, but like are just getting enough traction to keep the conversation going. Like, dare I say it, Morbius, like Ambulance, like Turning Red, like Everything Everywhere All at Once. Movies that like aren't opening tremendously, but like they're gaining more traction through word of mouth. So I don't know, Joe, I just wanted to ask you this before we got started with our conversation. Is there a chance? Do movies actually have a chance of being part of the culture again, outside of just superhero movies?
They definitely do. It's resetting right now. I think we're still in a COVID hangover where studios are trying to figure out exactly what movies are going to really take off at the theater. Sonic had a lot going for it, right? Because it was a sequel to a beloved first, and beloved is maybe a strong word, but people really enjoyed it. And it was getting good reviews right off the bat. So people were excited for it, and people were looking for family fare. You had Sonic, though. Sonic was a big release, and then you had Fantastic Beasts come out, and we have The Bad Guys this weekend, and there's just a lot of family stuff going on where I think it starts to monopolize or cannibalize, I should say, themselves at some point. And you're also dealing with the fact that COVID is, I said COVID hangover, but it's still around. So parents, not all parents are like willing to send their kids back in there. You talk about a movie, Sean and I were talking about this this past week, But you talk about a movie like Spider-Man No Way Home that took off and stuff like that, that there's a lot more momentum behind that. And you're talking about teenagers, you're talking about, 20 to 34-year-olds and all that stuff that are really driving all of that. So I think to kind of boil it down, the studios are just figuring out what's going to work. What's the model moving forward for sending things to streaming or to VOD or to theaters? And that's why I think we're getting these weird pockets where, they wanted to, last week also was spring break for a lot of schools, right? So they wanted to take advantage of that time with some of these more family oriented films. Fantastic Beasts, I think, is an example of that. I don't think it's a terrible movie. I think the second one was absolutely horrendous, in my opinion.
I've made the joke frequently about the second one that if you held a gun to my head, I'd be dead in 3 seconds because I wouldn't be able to tell you a single plot line that happened in that movie.
Absolutely. And this one streamlines things a little bit, but I think that they lost so much favor after the second one. And then again, you have COVID, you have other family films that are out that people want to go see. It's Fantastic Beasts. People aren't necessarily up to, the Harry Potter level. So I think we're still dealing with films that aren't going to do as well as we're used to, because if they're not those major blockbusters, they're not going to be killing it at the box office. There's still something to be, I think you have to account for COVID in some fashion there. But yeah, I think it's all going to balance out in the future. The reshufflings with Warner Brothers and with Disney, especially, where, you're going to start seeing, I think, one Searchlight movie here and there and stuff like that. Like, they're still going to put all their eggs in those baskets, but it's going to be a little bit different than the previous, like, quote unquote schedule of January was where you dump terrible movies and, or like horror movies and stuff like that. And, it's just all different.
Yeah, we're definitely in a restructuring period right now. I think Luke puts it best, where you had something like Ambulance, which again is like an original action movie that again would have thrived if it come out in theaters like 10, 15 years ago. And now it's like a box office bomb because it's like, it just is the demand there for like an original action movie that's not part of an already pre-existing IP franchise. And meanwhile, then you have a movie like The Bad Guys, which seemed like a fun, cutesy movie. It seemed like a movie that I would have watched, that I would have loved. And it comes out and it's doing way better than I thought. I'm like, holy shit. So there is still hope for a non, Disney or Warner Brothers or big studio associated, original animated movie, and it's doing really well. Apparently, they've had The Bad Guys for over a month, and in order to kind of double off your point about family features, I mean, look at the Encanto thing. Like, Encanto comes out, does terrible in like its first week of release, gets pulled, gets dropped on Disney Plus around like early December, right before Christmas, has this massive springboard of effect. Everyone goes nuts over to the point where they put it back in theaters, and then they put their and then that's when they make their money. So you're right. We are in this really interesting time period where, again, the likelihood of movies that are not like associated with giant IPs, more than likely superheroes, the likelihood of them doing well opening in theaters are not, it's just not going to happen. But now you're seeing, in a strange way, like kind of like almost like I want to call it like a new phase of like the DVD fad in like the early 2000s, where a movie could come out, may not do super well initially, but like over time and traction, through over time, back in the day it would have been DVD, and now through streaming it can like almost have this secondary life. And I feel like that's what we're going to start seeing now, more and more with these smaller movies, most definitely. Now,
I think the other thing, Dom, too, is like in the past we used to judge the quality of a movie based on how it did at the box office, and I think what we're seeing across the board now, I was just looking up real quick when you mentioned The Bad Guys doing well. The Bad Guys stole #1. The Northman opened #4 projected, which is what it was projected to do, but Unbearable's behind it, so they're pretty solid movies. But, they're not making a killing at the box office. And that doesn't mean they're bad movies. It's just that I think the market has changed.
Yeah, the market has changed significantly. And if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that genre and kind of stylism of movie, because I know genre doesn't necessarily apply to everything, is definitely having a much more market effect on people's, on how people want to spend their dollars going out to the movie theaters now more so than ever, especially because, I mean, ticket prices for those big theater chains are not going down anytime soon.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. So let's get into it. So like I said, we're talking about two movies today. We're talking about The Northman from Robert Eggers, and we're talking about The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent from Tom Gormican, which is sort of like a faux, like a kind of parody of Nick Cage's entire career vehicle, while also serving as a slight comeback. But I wanted to talk about The Northman first, because I had 3 points that I really wanted to hit, because this was a movie that, So strangely enough, so this is a movie from one of my favorite new directors, Robert Eggers. He put out The Witch and The Lighthouse recently, kind of part of like A24's new, like, horror revisionist movement alongside Ari Aster.
the Vitch.
the double V Vitch. But yeah, so I made a list, because you know how much I love making lists, as you're probably well aware, of what I like to call the new film brats. And the reason why I say this is because these are filmmakers who have popped up in roughly the last 5 years. They could be either they could either be Gen Xers or millennials. And for the most part, these are the guys who, when they have a new movie coming out, they may not be like the most like market sellable name. Like, you may not recognize their name instantly. In fact, out of all these names that I'm probably about to name off, the only one that like let's say like regular average Joes will probably realize and actually recognize is probably gonna be Jordan Peele, because the rest of these guys, you wouldn't know them outside of our circles. You wouldn't know them unless you heard their movies. And I have on this list, so I got Peele, Taika Waititi, Ryan Coogler, Yorgos Lanthimos, Ari Aster, Alex Garland, Eggers, Corey Finley, Barry Jenkins, and the Safdie brothers. And to me, all those guys are kind of like what I've been kind of starving for recently, which is like, these kind of, like I said, Gen Xers who either didn't really hit it until later on. Like I said, they have to have, in order to meet these qualifications, they have to have like really hit it off in like the last like 5 to 7 years roughly. So like 2014, 2015 is really when they came on the block, or later. And these are the guys that are like kind of like, for lack of a better word, doing like all the artistic stuff that I wish that like more mainstream blockbusters were doing, but obviously they can't because they have to cater to more mainstream demands, And obviously I go back to the 70s all the time as far as being my absolute favorite decade of film, because that was just a decade when it felt you were getting all the film brats coming right out of school. They were going right to work, making all these awesome, crazy conspiracy theorist movies. And they were all really artistic. They were all really character driven. They were all really character focused. They were all, for the most part, mid-budget, and they all did really well. They all made a lot of money. And so I'm always kind of fixated, and I'm always kind of hungering for like, who are going to be the next group of those guys? Who is going to be the new Lucas? Who is going to be the new Spielberg? Who is going to be the new Scorsese? Who is going to be the De Palma? Because that's part of like the evolution of film, right? Is going to see who is going to step up and like kind of take over from the masters. If anything, I think it's kind of been to the detriment of film as a long form movement. The fact that we have been kind of fixated on a lot of these artists for sometimes like 30, 40 years. And the sad truth of the matter is a lot of them are not able to maintain that consistency over that period of time. People thought that Spielberg was done up until he did West Side Story last year. So Eggers is really interesting in that, because Eggers, like I said, he's only had 2 feature films up until this point. He's focused primarily on horror revisionism. His big focus has been, period piece horror. He tackled Puritan era early colonialism in The Witch, and he tackled, I keep forgetting the time period, but like I think, what was it, like 1400s to 1500s, like sailor, like folk tale with the lighthouse, right? And each time,
special movie,
something like that. And I saw that movie at a midnight screening in October of 2019, and
Jesus.
it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Anyway, that's 2019. I could go down a rabbit hole there. But so now you have his third film, The Northman, which is easily his most traditional film yet. It's the first film that he doesn't do with A24. He's teaming up with Alexander Skarsgard. The story structure itself is pretty much like it's Hamlet, it's Conan the Barbarian. It's dude has got to get revenge for a misdeed that another member of his family committed against his father. And then as a result, he goes on this, epic quest for revenge. And this is probably the first instance where I'm like, everything about this movie works and is succinct and is tight-knit and flows. Like, it's probably the most, like, for lack of a better word, normal feeling story that Robert Eggers has done yet. But there still feels like there's something missing. Did you feel the same way?
Yeah, so I struggled right out of the gate with this because the initial, and we're getting into spoilers, right?
Oh, 100%.
Okay, good. So the initial transition from seeing him as a kid when he goes off and he's like, I will avenge you, father, and all that stuff. Yeah. And then you get to him like angry Alexander Skarsgård rowing and whatever. That whole part of his life where he was with this like traveling band of bandits, essentially bandit Vikings, like, just raising towns and all that, wasn't really developed enough for me. Like, I wanted to know like how he got there. I wanted to know, like, I know that the whole howling thing and the connection with your animal instinct and all that is probably based in fables from, Viking lore and stuff like that. But it's just presented without much explanation. And then the switch happens when Bjork shows up and is like, yo, here's a teardrop. And that is the part that bothered me the most. I felt like there wasn't enough development of why he hadn't gone back yet, right, to avenge his father and, rescue his mother and all that stuff. And then the switch right back to it. Totally fine with it. Totally get it, that it's like part of the movie. But that part bothered me a little bit. I thought that was a little underdeveloped. The rest of it flowed very well for me. I really liked this movie all in all. The action's absolutely incredible. There's a few spots that are seemingly like, I was like, oh, that guy's on wires. You can totally tell. But the rest of the visuals are what drives this for me.
Right. For sure.
It's a beautiful film filmed in Northern Ireland, or Iceland. Sorry, Northern Iceland, and it's just the scenic views are stunning.
Yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful film. Like, Eggers knows how to capture visuals. He's pretty much got the same creative team that he has last time. Yaron Blosh doing cinematography and all that. But a couple things that I noted, both going into it and coming out of this movie. This is the first film that he does not write with his brother Max. I actually have to check and see if Max helped co-write The Witch, but this is the first film that he does not co-write with his brother Max. He writes it with, I believe it's an Icelandic screenwriter named Sjorn, I believe is her name.
Correct.
What's it called? That, like I said, this is the first film that he does not do with A24. He does this film with Focus Features, who are very clearly trying to market this as more of, in a strange way, like an ambulance. It feels like a movie that we would have gotten like 10, 15, 20 years ago, and it would have done amazingly well. But it doesn't quite feel like a 2022 movie. And he has been very, very vocal about this in interviews about it. This is his first film that he did not get final cut on. And I think that's kind of where we can start to dissect and figure out like kind of the root of this film and kind of what's missing. Because as I'm watching this movie, you're 100% right. Like, it's got the visuals, it's got like kind of like the feeling like you're watching like a period piece. Like there's something really like intrinsic about capturing a period piece in like kind of like a non-kitschy or like mainstream way that feels really artistic, and that's something that he was able to capture beautifully with The Witch in the Lighthouse. And here, it just doesn't feel like it has it. It feels almost too mainstream for its own good. And also, it's and I had this written down as a note, and bear with me here for a second. It feels like the story itself seems to be in constant feud with the style. And what I mean by that is that you don't necessarily, it's funny because this is actually a conversation that I had with another collaborator of ours, Professor Pat, who's been on the channel several times. And Pat famously is not the biggest fan of Eggers movies, because The Witch he thinks is pretty good up until the ending, and he is not a fan of The Lighthouse at all. And that's the thing that I really noticed is I'm like, Eggers is not a guy who's really concerned with like kind of, with story. He's much more so visceral. He's much more so about placing you inside the characters' heads. He's much more so about the psychology of the characters, and everything that he does with his films on a technical level is all about presenting. Like you take The Lighthouse, right? Like the opening shot of that, like you're right there with Pattinson and Dafoe, and the majority of that movie, you don't actually like know what's going on, but that's part of like the mystery. That's part of the fun, is you want to stay suckered in because you want to find out what's going on, Same thing with The Witch, you're on that farm. There's all these, there may be all this crazy stuff going on. You have these amazing, beautiful wide shots with all these vistas in there. And you're not sure. There's kind of an unknowing to his stories, right? Like, what's it called? And that's what kind of like keeps the suspense going up until the final act. And it's really creative and unique and interesting. And that's not to be found here. That is not to be found here at all. Mostly because it is so traditionalist, you know exactly what's going to happen from the opening scene when the uncle comes in and kills the dad and everything, And so despite no matter how many cool visuals this movie throws at you, no matter how many awesome, surprisingly violent moments this movie throws at you, no matter how many crazy, nutso, witchy imagery to me, there's something to me about the inherent predictability of the story, just based on the fact that it's the first time that he's directed a movie, or us as audience members are somewhat familiar with where it's going to go, which feels completely antithetical to his style of filmmaking. That just, it takes away to me from a lot of how awesome this movie could have been, and just makes it kind of good,
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that. I don't know that it takes away how good it could have been. I think it just doesn't jive with what I was expecting from Eggers. Eggers always has a headier, larger message, or larger, not even message, but, contemplative space for you to kind of take the story in whatever direction you want. And this is more prescribed and more accessible than any of the films prior. It's Lion King, it's Hamlet, it's everything that you said.
You know the story. The story beats like beat for beat.
Absolutely. And, I think for a wider market, that's probably a smart move for someone like Eggers right now, right? You want to get something out there that's going to be a little bit more accessible and maybe grab the attention of people that weren't interested in seeing what Willem Dafoe and what's his name we're going to do in the Lighthouse together,
Oh yeah, Pattinson.
It's a little, and also you got to remember that he, like you said, he's with Focus Features now,
right?
A24 gives a lot more space to kind of play around and do whatever.
Just lets the artist just go. Sometimes the disastrous results, but when they work, oh man, they hit.
But then with this, I mean, he didn't get final cut because of the budget. The budget was so much higher here. It was, like I said, with focus features. So I think that that's why we're getting a more straightforward film. I don't know for me if that takes away from the ultimate film itself. I just think that it doesn't jive with what we were to expect.
Right.
It's like watching a Taika Waititi movie without the subtle humor that we come to expect, right?
Oh, that's funny that you think his humor is subtle, but
well, I think like a Jojo Rabbit type movie with like some of the jokes
sense,
underneath, like they're drier and stuff,
right? Yes.
If you're talking Ragnarok and probably Love and Thunder, then it's like in your face shit, which I also love. But
definitely. I mean, if we're going to talk about Taika real quick, I'm much more so a fan of Taika when he goes for subtlety over kind of the more obvious humor. But 100%. But it's so interesting that you bring that up because you're right. Like, obviously, he seems like he's trying to ascend to a more, what's the word I'm looking for? To a more accessible point in his career. Mm-hmm. The Witch and the Lighthouse, they were like kind of very niche, very like kind of like low-key cult status, which again is what has kind of made A24 what it is. But if he's trying to move on to, and make a movie that is still true to what he enjoys doing while at the same time becoming more accessible, I mean, this in theory is the thing to do. But the craziest part is that I don't necessarily know how many people are going to actually watch this movie in theaters. I personally, I don't see the appeal for this on the mainstream market right now because it's like, okay, so it's got Alexander Skarsgard who's been really good on TV, but he's not quite a movie star. Like the last movie that he was in was the last movie that he was in that like actually opened to somewhat wide was The Legend of Tarzan, which was 6 years ago now.
Godzilla vs. Kong too.
And Godzilla vs. Kong last year, but like people were not watching that movie for Alexander Skarsgard,
Yeah.
What's it called? As funny as he did get in that movie, so you've got that. Everybody that they've got in the movie is like really good actors, but like, again, people don't watch movies for actors anymore. Like we've said, the idea of, movie stars selling movies is kind of inherently dead, at least in this. And you said that it opened like number 4, number 5 at the box office?
Which it was projected to do.
Right. But
I think, Dom, like the thing too is kind of goes back to my statement earlier, right? Or my comment earlier about quality being measured by the box office performance.
Right.
Looking at the film itself, like I think it's really good. If you want to talk about the business side of things and if it's actually going to be marketable and people are going to want to go out and see it, I think it's going to have a little, I don't want to say longevity, but it's going to be in the theaters a couple of weeks because people are going to get word of mouth and go see a solid Viking movie. But at a time where this is where it gets again into the business shit, where inflation is so bad in the country and, gas prices are high and whatever, things that are being cut are things like this going to the movies.
Right.
And then when you have a big tentpole like Doctor Strange coming out in 2 weeks now.
Yeah, something like that.
People are like, oh, we'll hold off to that. That's where
Not to mention the fact that on off weeks as well, in between, you have like great TV shows coming back. Like next weekend, I wouldn't be surprised if they're not even bothering to open a movie next weekend because the last season of Ozark is dropping on Netflix, and they know that everybody's going to be at home watching that as well. It's like, we are in a really interesting, fascinating time as well for movies, which is why all of this stuff to me is worth talking about because it all matters.
For sure.
And I think that in today's day and age now, is like the business aspects matter now more than ever because again, and this has kind of been a thing since before the pandemic, which is where it almost felt like for a movie to open at number 1 in the box office and have it not be associated with the big IP. But ironically enough, like we're going to talk about in The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent when we get to that, it has to have like an interesting, neat hook to it. And while again, the fact that this movie actually, is a film that opened in a theater, and I absolutely love that. I don't know if it had kind of the hook that it needed in order to draw people in, because the thing about Witch, because the thing about The Witch and the Lighthouse is those were both A24. They're both very niche. They both felt very different. You got the sense that you were like going to watch those movies and get an experience unlike any other. And for the most part, those two movies delivered, and they were able to like kind of matriculate throughout the pop culture status through word of mouth. Like there were a lot of people who I talked to who watched The Lighthouse. There were a lot of people who I talked to back in 2016 that watched The Witch. And obviously we got to give it some time, but like I don't know how many people are going to watch The Northman. Now, part of that obviously is just based on what it's opening up against. The other part of that is just based on who will actually be going out of their way to watch this in a theater versus who may accidentally stumble upon this when it goes to a streaming service 3 or 4 months later. Who the hell knows? But that to me is kind of like where like the root of it is, because the thing about the movie is the movie itself, it's perfectly accessible. It's fine. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, even though it's still my least favorite of the 3 that Eggers has directed so far. In a strange way, like just for my own personal taste, I compare it a lot to last year's Last Night in Soho, which is another film that is from one of my favorite working directors, Edgar Wright, and has everything in that movie that I love about his signature style. But it just felt like he's on a different point in his career now that really kind of doesn't offer the same kind of value, let's say, that his previous efforts did. Now, As for Eggers and where that'll take him as far as what he does next, I don't know. But I guess just in the sense of where like every movie that I watch now, I kind of examine it from two aspects. I examine it from the aspect of where I'm going to enjoy it, and the aspect of where what are other people are not even necessarily if they're going to enjoy it, because people's enjoyment of things varies greatly. I find it's whether they're going to watch it and whether they're going to talk about it, and that to me is like way more of an indicator of a movie's success now. That's not like associated with a big pop culture like well-known IP that everyone is going to go out and watch because everyone's already familiar with that. And that was kind of already the case before the pandemic, but I think it's even more vital now post-pandemic, because like we were just talking about before, the option has come back for movies to open up and have a second life. Like, just for example, like a movie that just won an Oscar, King Richard, the Will Smith controversy aside, I came home yesterday, I'm podcasting from my house this time as opposed to, my apartment. And my mom was just saying, yeah, I just watched that on a plane like the other day. And I'm like, Mom, I watched that movie like 4 months ago when it came out, like when it dropped on HBO Max, but like, that's the sort of thing that happens now. And that's been happening for like quite a while now, but I guess this is like the first time where it's like we can really like actually start to look at that and dissect it and be like, okay, if a movie doesn't like open at #1 at the box office, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the end, whereas back in 2019, if a movie didn't open at the top of the box office, boom, it may as well have been done, and then it's considered a streaming dump. But those terms have come to mean so many different things now in today's day and age,
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think one point to make here with Eggers too and his 3 films is while this opened at #4, it's still the most successful opening weekend of his 3 movies. So taking a look at the bigger picture there, he's scaling up. He's on. I mean, the Witch opened better than The Lighthouse, but that rolled out like really odd and like smaller theaters first and all that stuff, and didn't go wide for a while. Never really went quite wide, I don't think.
Yeah, it didn't. I don't think.
So, in terms of business and looking at that, I think that's kind of a positive sign. But you're right. I mean, like the entire landscape is different now with streaming and with VOD, and people seeing that, like, or studios seeing that they can get good return for releasing movies on VOD. We talked offline a little bit jokingly about Nick Cage movies, and we'll talk about that moving forward. But, Willy's Wonderland is a good example. And I've chatted with the director a few times. So like, that's where my bias is coming in. But that was successful because it dropped at a time where no one was going to theaters because of COVID. It hit VOD, and it probably got a better run than it would have gotten if it would just went to theaters. Or like the limited number of theaters that an indie like that would drop to.
Right.
So I think that there's a lot to be said for like taking a look at how the market has shifted and what the different means of getting films out there are. And again, like thinking into #1 films, I don't really know, like outside of IP, trying to think back real quick, what the last major non-IP film to debut at #1
I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
And so I just think that
maybe Crazy Rich Asians, maybe.
Yeah.
That might be it.
I just think that we're very obsessed with the box office performance and opening weekend, and then we drop off and focus on the next week.
Right, because that's what it was for so long. It's like if a movie doesn't open #1 at the box office, it's gone in like the next week, because that was just the running mantra for so long.
But also, like, social media is so different now too, right? And TikTok, for example, is the thing that drove Encanto like to the top. So, or we don't talk about Bruno and more specifically,
right?
So it's just so different. I think we got to look long term, what the staying power of these films is going to be, and hope for the best there. I think the 4 films that came out this week are going to do well again next week, respectively, because the only 2 wide releases are Memory and I think another movie called 65 or something.
Okay.
And Memory's Liam Neeson. So, it has
great. We're still getting those. Awesome.
Yeah. He's like the James Patterson of movies. Like he just releases.
Didn't he say that he was done making those movies after Cold Pursuit came out back in 2019?
Please.
Yeah. We know.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's challenging. I think like quality of the movie though, it is, I think, a really solid movie that's going to be
100%.
I compare it to The Revenant in a way. I don't know why this keeps coming back, but it's the feel of The Revenant.
I was thinking about that.
It's a solid movie, but not everyone is going to like run out to see it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't take away from the fact that The Revenant that got noms.
Got noms and won 2 Oscars.
Yeah. So
won Iñárritu and it won DiCaprio his first Oscar. Finally.
So I think like, it's just it's a weird time for movies.
Yeah, it is definitely a weird time for me. Wow, that's so fascinating. I didn't even think about that, which is crazy because The Revenant, that was another movie that, like, I really liked it the first time I saw it because there were just things in that movie that I had never seen before.
Yep.
And then after the fact, I kind of look back and I'm like, was that movie really that good? And part of that was just the whole hype machine behind Leo. You know, they're like, we need to get Leo his Oscar for this movie.
This is the time.
Should he have won? No, obviously we all know we should have won for Wolf of Wall Street 2 years before, but, you know, that's in the past. So final star rating before we move on to, let's face it, the real star of this podcast.
I'm 4 out of 5 on this one.
Yeah, same. I gave it 4 out of 5.
Pulled me back.
Yeah, and like I said, it's good. The tactical behind the scenes kind of like, because of the promise for the first third of it, I was like just distracted because I'm like, oh man, he would have edited that differently here. He would have edited that differently here, you know, but I had to get out of my film brain for a second. But after a while, like, specifically once we got to the end with like the Nicole Kidman twist and then, you know, him with his brother, that was when I'm like, oh shit, now I'm in, you know?
We need to talk about that too. Like the acting in this, I thought was phenomenal. I really liked everyone across the board.
It was one of those things where I didn't know if I was going to like how over the top everyone was being in the first half, and then over the course of the movie, everybody won me over. Like, I was not a fan of the kid that was playing young Alexander Skarsgård in the beginning. I wasn't quite sure what Ethan Hawke was doing. I'm like, Ethan Hawke, everybody loves Ethan Hawke now, and Ethan Hawke to me is like more of an acquired taste. He's great in some movies and in other movies. I'm like, are we sure we really like him? You know, but he's definitely been winning me back with his last couple of roles. I think he's fantastic on Moon Knight. I think he's like, he is like a revelation in terms of like the villains that they found for those Disney Plus Marvel shows. So
yeah, I think Anya Taylor-Joy really was great in this. She's someone that I enjoy, but never think she has
coming back to her roots too after breaking out in The Witch originally.
Yeah, and she never really has the material to, I think, like take off as the big actress that we all expect her to be. And I think like some of the issues around films that she was in, probably drove that. But I really liked her in this. And Nicole Kidman, I was wondering if at the beginning it was a one and done where it was kind of like, okay, Ethan Hawke is gone, so she's probably gone too. But that whole twist with her was just, she went crazy.
That was the type of overacting from Nicole Kidman that I have not seen from a long time.
It was awesome.
And I loved every single minute of it. I'm like, oh shit. I'm like, she's going for like 90 plus degrees. Like totally. I'm like, she's trying to, I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, we're actually doing this now. Okay.
I walked out and was like, was Nicole Kidman my favorite part of that movie?
I don't know, man. It's crazy. Well, like, okay, well, in a movie that has Willem Dafoe, Ethan Hawke, and I mean, Skarsgård doesn't overact too much, but he's been known to dial it up a couple times, you know, Big Little Lies and, you know, Passing, to name a few. But I'm like, you got a movie with those three actors in it, and Nicole Kidman is somehow overacting them all. Like, that's insane to me, just to think about.
And also because, like, you take Willem Dafoe and you put him to the side, right? Because you know what you're getting from him in every movie. By
the way, stop putting Willem Dafoe in the side of movies. It happened twice now. First with Nightmare Alley, and then with this movie where he's just kind of only in it for a few minutes. It's like, no Way Home proved. It's like, no, this man is a fucking star. Make him a fucking star. Like,
but I think he's happy to take these roles and focus on other bigger films. Of course,
and all the filmmakers that he's working with. It's like, come on, who can blame him? You know, he shows up for like 5 seconds in The French Dispatch amongst like all the other actors that Wes Anderson gets. He's great. But yeah, no, it was that part. Watching the acting was definitely the most fun part for me. You know, I'm still queasy about like Hollywood, like, you know, and the vast age difference there, but I'm like, you know what, whatever. That's a thing. And since time immemorial, since Hollywood history,
I was gonna say, it's always been a thing.
That's always been a thing. I know. So that's kind of our review on The Northman. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you actually watch this movie, let us know if you plan on watching this movie. But also be sure to follow this guy with everything that he's got going on. I just realized I pointed in the opposite direction. That's fine. They know who I'm talking about. Follow this guy with everything he's got going on at Guy at the Movies across all platforms. Now, Joe, let's move on to the real star of this. You know, like I said, he had a micro comeback. He's been having like a weird comeback the last couple of years, right? He had Mandy in 2018. I don't think he had anything in 2019. 2020 was the pandemic year, so nothing dropped. And then last year he had obviously the trifecta between Willy's Wonderland, Prisoners of the Ghostland, and Pig, which he came this close to getting an Oscar nomination for. And of course, we're talking about the one, the only. It's Nick fucking, I can't do it as long as he did, Cage, with The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. This is a movie that when I first heard about this premise, I'm like, this is a joke. I'm like, this is an actual joke. I'm like, this is finally it. Hollywood is finally run out of chances for this guy, and they are playing his swan song, and they're like, just go. It's like Jonah Hill in The Wolf of Wall Street, where he's like, you know, it's just like, yeah, if I had a kid that, you know, turned out like, you know, like that. It's like I would bring it out into the field, and I would just, you know, just let it go and be like, now you're free, just go. You know, I feel like that's what they were doing with Nick Cage with this movie for a little bit, and so naturally I am shocked when not only was this movie obviously, not only good, but great. And actually one of the few movies that actually held up to, how awesome the trailers were making it out to be. But I don't think I've ever enjoyed a movie this much that has just left me utterly confused after a movie watching it. And I think you can understand where I'm coming from here.
I think we enjoyed it a little bit differently. I was fine with the movie. I liked it. I didn't love it. I asked myself multiple times, like, what the hell is going on? What are we doing here? Like, why is this a thing? And I thought that, like, it's very meta. It's very self-referential. It's slightly obnoxious in some places. But I thought Pedro Pascal was the breakout star of this movie. He was so good to me. And Nicolas Cage is just Nicolas Cage and everything to me now. I think that's kind of like, you know what you're getting. He was amped up a little bit and playing like a ridiculous, like, I think he said in an interview, like ADHD style Nicolas Cage. But I thought Pedro Pascal was the best part of it. I thought the story was fine. I had a good time, but I walked out of it just being like, yep, that's what I expected.
So we talked about this a little bit in the pre-show, and I wanted to kind of like fully dissect this point here because I only had one point about this movie because I was racking my brain. I could not come up with any other points to bring up about this movie, which is Hollywood playing a practical joke on Nicolas Cage? Because you always have those actors where obviously, again, we are both participants in the internet age. We're both very familiar with memes and how kind of all of, let's just call it mainstream culture, has almost devolved into the memes. And so naturally you come with these actors, like unfortunately like to what just recently happened with Bruce Willis before he came out and revealed that the reason why he was doing like 30 movies a year that all went to VOD that nobody watched or heard of was because he was just trying to get as much work in as possible before, unfortunately, his condition that he had got too worse to a point where he was just physically unable to work, which in hindsight, yeah, it does, take a couple of, light fun that the internet was making and definitely kind of sours that a little bit. But Cage is a guy where just everything about him, like the more and more people found out, and it's funny because Cage was kind of like an early onset, like victim of the internet's memeability. Like I still remember being in high school and like my friends making fun of me nonstop because of like the whole Nicolas Cage memification. And I'm like, and that was before I was even really like embroiled in like the social media and pop culture status. So for the most part, I really didn't know what they were talking about. I'm like, because they would always make fun of Nicolas Cage. And I'm like, I don't get it. Because I hadn't seen that many Nicolas Cage movies at that point. I'm like, I don't get it. I'm like, everything I've seen him in, he's pretty good for the most part. Like, I don't understand why people hate him. And then I started looking into his film history and like the nature of his performances. And of course, I discovered the incredible Nick Cage freak out montage on YouTube that we've all seen. That is one of the funniest videos I've ever seen on YouTube. It's between that and Arnold Schwarzenegger's one-liners, the one-liners montage. That was like two of my most watched videos on YouTube, like when I first started getting into that junior year of high school. And then I understood. I'm like, oh, okay. This guy has devolved from like somebody that people used to take seriously into just a joke. And like, that's what kind of the reason that people only like him, And like I said, there's a lot of people who can like make a lot of success off of that. There are actors who have kind of learned that they're a little bit of a joke and start to play into it. Sometimes a disastrous result, sometimes to, more effective results. And the weird thing about Cage was that Cage both did and did not do that, because by just continuing to almost like kind of ignore a lot of the stuff that the internet was saying and just, keep his head down and just continue to work and do all these garbage projects that went straight to VOD, where, obviously the joke was that he just had to take paycheck after paycheck after paycheck after paycheck in order to pay for his vast amount of just crazy stuff that he did. And now you have it where, in a strange way, I've talked about this, where you almost have a Star Wars prequel syndrome here, where he's been the subject of the joke and the punchline for so long, and people have been making fun of it for so long, that you're almost starting to see like a reverse thing happen, where people are starting to question, like, okay, is Nick Cage as bad as people say or remember? Like, or is it just the fact of he may have just gotten a little bit of unfair hate? Because I listen to Bill Simmons religiously, and even he talks about, like, on the Rewatchables episode that they do on old Nick Cage movies, and even he's confused at certain points where it's like, is he trolling everyone, or is he like actually like really buying into this as an actor? And I feel like it's that constant unknowing that has made him the subject of so much fascination these last couple of years, and in a strange way has contributed to almost this weird pseudo comeback that he's been having. I don't know. What's really your thoughts on that?
So again, I don't know that it's a comeback, because I think he's been making films for quite a while. Whether they've been seen or not is a whole nother question. But base question, how old are you, Dom?
I am 24. I'm going to be 25 in August.
Okay. So there's a good 11 years between us.
Yes.
And it's so funny hearing Nicolas Cage referred to as like the question of, is he in on the joke? Does he realize?
Right.
Because that's not the Nicolas Cage I grew up with.
Right.
when you're talking about like, you know, Leaving Las Vegas, The Rock, 8mm, Face Off, Con Air, Gone in 60 Seconds, The Family Man, like all of those are class. Even Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which is such a goofball
man, they even
movie.
referenced that in this movie
They
too.
did.
That killed me.
Wind Talkers, Matchstick Men, National Treasure, of course, Lord of War, The Weatherman. Like he was in World Trade Center. He was in The Wicker Man.
That's right. I forgot about World Trade Center.
There's so much that he's so good at. Now, like, you know, what we're seeing with some of these older, I'm like getting really philosophical here, but what we're seeing with these older stars, and like Bruce Willis obviously had an intent, like he was doing what he did for a reason. There's a lot of them that are just like taking these projects and trying to branch out of the things that they may have been typecast to in the past, or maybe they believe in the property or whatnot. I think with Nick Cage, just knowing based on interviews, so knowing what I've read, he's a really good dude, and he really believes in filmmakers, the crew. He really believes in the people and storytelling, right? So I think you're getting this crazy shit from him because they're like, hey, we need you for 2 weeks to film this movie. We need you for 6 weeks to do, you know, whatever it may be. And he has the back of these filmmakers. He has the back of these new people that are coming on the scene, because I think that he sees it as kind of like his lasting legacy is to help them get started and like propel them in. So is there a joke about him? Like, yeah, he's definitely had some memes spawned about him, but I don't think that takes away at all from what he's done in the past. And when you have Tom Gormican coming in here, who, you know, previously had done, I think The Awkward Moment with Zac Efron back in like 2014. Oh my
God, he did that movie?
Mm-hmm.
And then shit.
And the show Ghosted that was on, I think maybe a season, but it was kind of like, it was Adam Scott and Craig Robinson, where they were like the paranormal.
Oh my God. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Now that I'm familiar with this. Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense.
He takes like, you know, like a realistic thing and puts that spin on it. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you look at Unbearable.
Weight of Massive Talent.
Damn that name. So I think he knew exactly what he was getting into, Nick Cage here. They probably said like, here's what we want to do. We want to play with the fact that like you're a stalwart in the entire acting community. People know you. You're recognizable. You've had some crazy memes. You do a lot of wild movies. Cinephiles are going to see you for the wild shit that you've done recently with Color Out of Space and Mandy and all that stuff. Older fans are going to be like, Nick Cage, that's right. Remember when he was in The Rock and Con Air and Face Off and all that? And he just went for it. You know, I think that's, at the end of the day, it's just a goofy movie that they were like, let's try something original and fun. And that's how we ended up with Massive Talent.
Indeed. Yeah, it's so weird. I love that you bring that up, because that's great, because the whole thing about it is this is a movie that is both simultaneously paying homage to Nick Cage while at the same time like just relentlessly mocking him. And it's kind of, I always love when Hollywood movies can like hit that like that sweet spot in between where it ends up coming off as like just the right amount of endearing while also coming off as just like not completely cynical, because it's really easy for this like for a movie like this and a property like this to sink into like just mean-spirited territory, where it's just ruthlessly, relentlessly mocking him. But they end up like generating kind of this like really endearing tale of friendship that comes from this. And also like they actually like come up with like a pretty compelling arc just about him in general. And is it probably is it very easily fabricated and like an easy trope that like comedy writers and directors can come up with 100%? But yeah. I love that point that you brought up before about Nick Cage, like kind of now that he's in, he's in this new phase of his career, he's a little bit older, and now he's trying to like, kind of give a couple changes to his legacy and kind of give, a lot of these up and coming talents, kind of their shot, for lack of a better word. I think that plays in perfectly, because you have a movie where Nick Cage is playing a washed up version of himself who Hollywood is completely ready to be done with. And he has to essentially carry out this like fictionalized CIA mission that ends up becoming real, and halfway through when he's invited to this reclusive billionaire's gorgeous Spanish estate that's like this random island, like the setup and the jokes are all there, but like it's how they play into it to a point where they're not quite winking and nodding to the audience like every 5 seconds, but they do it just enough to make it like really, really endearing and really, really special. And like, I end up coming out of this movie where the first half of this movie, I'm groaning because I'm like, okay, they're getting all the jokes out of the way. But by the end of the movie, I'm like, man, they really had like something special here, And it's funny because if we could take the Nick Cage out of it for a second, it's that I look at another example of a movie that came out just a couple weeks ago that tried to do something similar to this, and it just completely failed miserably, which is Judd Apatow's The Bubble that dropped back in the beginning of the month in April, which is where that is a movie that is just feels like it is trying to capitalize on a series of jokes that stopped being funny 2 years ago.
Yeah,
where
absolutely.
you have this movie about a group of actors that are trying to make a movie during the pandemic, but it's all of the easiest jokes and like none of them land, and all the actors just look like they're trying to like mug for the camera, and it ends up resulting in like this really weird, misshapen mess where if this movie had come out like even a year ago, it would have been great, versus this is a movie that is not trying to be about the jokes because it centers around a character.
Where are the jokes?
Exactly. And it just works. It just completely works from top to bottom,
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I don't agree. Well, I totally agree with the assessment with the bubble and stuff. I don't think it works top to bottom here. I definitely think that it stays very one note in a lot of ways, but I see why people enjoy it. I totally understand that. I think the other thing with Nick Cage, like just to further support and maybe compare what I was saying about how I think he's just in this like, let's get some projects out there and support these new filmmakers or young filmmakers or whatnot. I've talked to directors that have worked with Nick Cage as well as directors that have worked with Bruce Willis on some of these films, like you were referencing films that were released straight to VOD that not a lot of people watched from Bruce Willis. And some of them are good, some of them aren't that great, but the consistent thing across the board has just been how giving and supportive and all in they are. And I think that that's a great thing to see from these
100%
people that have been, the actors that we think about in our lives for however long. So I think that's honestly what I think is happening here, right?
Yeah.
I think this is the most mainstream of that for him. Obviously, it's got the wide release with Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. I think people are going to have fun with it. I think that some people aren't going to get all the references, and that takes away from it a little bit. And then there's, the whole Paddington 2 thing.
Oh, that was great. That was awesome. That was hilarious.
Was amazing, but that probably meant more to us than it does the regular passerby.
But like I said, it's so fascinating because again, if that were just a joke that was cracked at the expense of and aimed at like fans of Paddington, it obviously wouldn't have landed. But it's the fact that it does come from such this place of endearment, this fact that it's this super fan who may also be a drug lord, but also loves Paddington too. It's like, I guess for lack of a better word, it's that thing that we used to love about comedy so much, that kind of like separates this from the ilk, and like, even though they come up and they're just ultimately creative, where they come up with these ridiculous scenarios in order to place these characters into, and just everyone involved is just so into it and so invested. It's ironic that you pointed out Pedro Pascal's being the breakout, because Pedro Pascal was also in the bubble, and there just felt like he was stumbling around and had nothing to do. And here,
the writing in that was horrendous.
It's just awful. But here it's like, no, Pascal is into it. Like, he knows exactly what it is they're making. He knows exactly just the right amount of endearment and fun to have with, and him and Cage, they have this really awesome dynamic that they develop. It's kind of like Cage is like, this older, like kind of legacy talent, and Pascal is like this guy who who you're not sure for a majority of the movie whether he is super violent, but you can tell is also just such a Nick Cage super fan that he like, it's great. I absolutely loved it. And like, yeah, the references not everyone is gonna get, but for me personally, as somebody who has watched the majority of his movies now, I'm just like, that's fucking great.
A friend of mine, when we left the screening, was giving his feedback to the reps, and he said something like, the ultimate bromance or something like that. And I was like, yeah, it's essentially what this is.
Well, essentially what I had written is, what's it called? I'm like, this is the opening line of my Letterboxd review, because I got to shamelessly self-plug my Letterboxd review. It's a parody of a parody inside of a parody wrapped up in enigma, and the enigma is Nicolas Cage. And that is kind of where, again, this movie genre hops so many different times, where it starts off as like, a dad who can't get his shit together, to an action movie, to a buddy cop comedy, to a rom-com, to like you said, like they make the joke about the CGI filled, action filled third act, and then for the most part they do the action filled third act, but it's all practical, and like all that stuff is it's just great. Like, that's the stuff that I'm like, oh my god, this is what I used to watch movies for, And I love how everyone was comparing the Bubble to Tropic Thunder, to like the new version of Tropic Thunder, but this to me is like way more so the version of the new version of Tropic Thunder that I've been kind of waiting for years, and it works because Cage is just the right guy to do that with,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that any other actor trying to focus in on like, this type of film, right? The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent with Tom Cruise, or whoever, you would not get the same thing.
Although I would like to see a parody version, but like where Tom Cruise is completely not in the joke, and it's like everyone else on the set is just trying to play a prank on him. That movie I would see like 100%. Like, that would actually be great. So, yeah. So final thoughts and final star ratings on the Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent.
Yeah, I honestly, I think Pedro Pascal is a standout. I want to say that again, because he looks like he's having a lot of fun here, and is, like you said, understands exactly what they're going for.
Yeah.
And I gave this a 3 out of 5. It's not, for me, it's not something that I loved. I enjoyed my time. I had a good time, but I was like, that's exactly what I expected it to be.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, for me, it's a 4 out of 5. It was an absolute blast. It was so much fun from start to finish, top to bottom. It ended up giving me so many different introspective things that I wasn't not at all expecting. And for me, it's like, wow, if these are the roles that we're going to get from Nick Cage going forward, I'm very, very excited to see.
You're not going to get more of this from Nick Cage moving forward. There will never be another role like this.
Hey, man, listen, I can dream, okay? I can dream.
Never be another role like this.
Yeah, but for me, it's a 4 out of 5 easily. But so that was it. Those were our reviews on The Northman and The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. Joe, thank you so much for joining me. This was an absolute blast. I cannot wait to have you back on the channel. Where can the good people follow you?
Absolutely. You can find me at guyatthemovies.com, Guy at the Movies on Instagram and TikTok and all that fun stuff. Guy at the Movies one on Twitter because someone took that. But apparently it's open now. I'm trying to get it. But anyway, hey, follow me on there. There's a lot of fun reviews and different content. We have the Guy at the Movies podcast with Joe and Sean every week. New episode coming out this Tuesday. We just started a Patreon with exclusive episodes and stuff.
Yeah.
So hop in, have some fun. It's it's a good time to be a fan of movies.
Absolutely. Yeah, and of course, follow me at Movie Nerd Reviews across all platforms. Be sure to follow the official Talking TV podcast across all platforms. Subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Twitch if you're not already. And as always, people, you know the slogan, 12 seasons in a short film. And watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.